Hi everyone. My name is Lewis Siru, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Purpose Union. And our focus is on helping organizations, businesses, charities, foundations to increase their social impact through the power of strategic communications and engagement. And my focus of my 20-minute sort of presentation today is to really focus on the importance of building coalitions to advance social change, highly relevant to the work of the centre and the conversations we've been having today. Also highly relevant to the world on a number of fronts, ranging from climate change to racial justice. There's a growing sense that some of these problems are so big, no one organisation, no one sector has all the solutions. Just briefly about me and my background. I've worked for both private companies and charities. And for a number of years, I had the privilege of being the first director of the Fair Education Alliance, which brought together now over 150 businesses, charities, trade unions, community groups to try and improve equity in education. Again, realizing that as fantastic as various individual efforts were, something was missing, and that was a coordination of activity, of messaging, and of intent. And this is a topic close to my heart, coming together to address social challenges. I was born in Newham, one of the most deprived parts of the country. My parents were immigrants from Nigeria, and so I saw firsthand the challenges, particularly of insecure living and homelessness across the borough. It was something that was very visceral, something that was apparent every day, and I really think that this is one of those sort of issues which the centre is having a huge, I think, impact on, and the need for evidence is incredibly important. I want to look at three things briefly. First of all, the need for collective action and a collective approach in order to build resilience in communities. Second of all, I just want to explore some of the principles that I think are important that I've learned over sort of my time advising various coalitions and obviously setting up and leading one. And then finally, sort of specifically communications, and why I think in a very noisy, challenging world where attention is key, coalitions can also be an important way of setting the national narrative and cutting through. So why are coalitions important for collective resilience and advancing social change? I mean, I'm always concerned sometimes when we talk about certain social issues and we address those problems as if we're playing a whack-a-mole, that we'll deal with the symptoms, but we won't really get to the nub of the idea. And there are a number of organizations who quite rightly address the remedies needed to support communities and to support individuals. But I think as the pandemic has shown, to build truly resilient communities, to build a society where we can anticipate, prepare for, be ready to deal with shocks, external shocks, or indeed social inequality that manifests itself in particular flashpoint moments. I think we need to get better at coordinating and getting better at setting a shared agenda, attacking it with zeal, with energy, and with focus. Some of these social challenges that I've just mentioned, homelessness being one of them, can feel overwhelming. And that's the nature of some of these wicked problems. They require multiple levers to be pulled. But I think through coordination, the impact that we can have can be multiplied. I think we've all seen it. I've been a sort of a charity sort of trustee a number of times, close to a number of charities and advisors to businesses, obviously through my day job. And what is telling sometimes is you might have a fantastic initiative or an idea without having spoken to or indeed coordinated with someone who's doing that exact same thing in a different area. So I think there are lots of hidden costs and explicit costs when we don't work together on a lot of these challenges. I think the timing is also really interesting as well. And I want to take racial justice as an example. I think over the last year, and we can debate whether or not we've made progress following the murder of George Floyd in the UK on racial justice and the conversation about racial justice. But what I will say, if you bear with me for just a second, is that I think we're beginning to have a conversation that moves from the individual and indeed the institutional to the structural, and thinking about that bigger piece and thinking about the interplay of lots of different institutions. And I think the read across to other issues, I think, is beginning to be made clear as well. We can see how the financial system, alongside other bits of the system, the food system, for example, work together in order to potentially hinder our ability to address climate change. So I think society is beginning to wake up to the idea that a lot of these issues can only be solved at a structural level, and that requires having more than one actor working together. And what's really fascinating is we do a poll of the public, of specifically millennial and Gen Z audiences, as to what matters to them. What do they expect of charities and businesses in terms of solving some of the social challenges, like housing, for example? And what is remarkable is the focus on coalitions, that actually coalitions, by quite a significant margin, are more trusted to deliver change, to deliver messages, more trusted than charities working on their own, businesses working on their own, and governments working on their own. So there's a clear demand for it. I think there's a growing recognition about the need for it. So begs the question how to make it work in order to build that sort of collective resilience. Well, I want to sort of explore some principles, and in the Q&A section that follows afterwards, we can debate some of these. But certainly from my experience, I think these are the ones which really strike me as quite important to get right in order to have impact and make coalitions work properly. I think the first is boldness, and that's specifically boldness in who you bring to the table. I think it's really easy to sort of map out a variety of stakeholders and approach the ones that you think are most closely aligned with your vision. And obviously alignment is important to some extent. What I thought was fascinating about the Fair Education Alliance was we managed to bring together, sort of education organizations, the leaders of their field, but we were able to also house trade unions and investment banks from the city, all because they shared the underlying passion for education inequality was there. And so I think there's a really interesting power in bringing together unusual partners together, many of whom may have disagreements on a range of policy, but finding the common touch point that can link everyone together, I think, can be incredibly powerful. And that requires boldness. It also requires boldness to some extent to work with organizations that sometimes you may regard as competitors or in your space. That doesn't come without practical challenges, for example, co-branding, fundraising, decision-making. But I think the goal has to be, if we're going to address really transigent challenges, like homelessness, for example, we have to bring the right people to the dance. The second principle and approach, which I think really matters, is co-design. And actually building a plan to affect change in collaboration with the coalition partners you've brought in. A question I get asked a lot is, what is the right size of a coalition? Is it 5 organizations, 10, 20, 30? And in many ways, that question is determined by what you're trying to achieve and indeed the nature of the problem. But having a sort of strategy as a collective built together not only builds trust, which I'll come to in a moment, but I think road tests that strategy and makes it more likely that it's going to be successful. I think the other benefit of that is you're more likely to align with those individual organization strategies if they've had an input into the collective strategy without watering it down. Third, sort of approach that I sort of think is important in order to sort of use coalitions effectively to drive social change is a shared agenda. What is it that we're trying to achieve? And I think the trap sometimes is that these problems are so big, so vast, that we struggle to get a grip of them individually or collectively. And we sort of end up with mission creep, or we pull at different directions. we have slightly different takes on how we solve the problem. So I think it's, and again, it's subject to debate, but personally, I think having a clear set of 1, 2, or 3 priorities that we can all agree on are either the quick wins or the sort of really sort of big free bets that we're willing to make, however you want to frame it, I think is more effective than having a shopping list that everyone throws into the mix. What that means is that if you imagine a Venn diagram, there are priorities that this coalition won't focus on because the others don't agree on it. But I think having that shared sense is really important. Again, at the Fair Education Alliance, we had 5 goals spread across the life journey of a child that we focused on. There are things that were not included in that. But we did it because actually, even though there's a variety of different organizations, we could broadly agree that in 5 years, this is what we want the UK to look like. I think having that shared sense of ownership for where you want the country to go on a variety of issues, I think can be really, really powerful. Quite frankly, in a society where we have so much information, people have so much overload, having that succinct, clear, and focused approach to sort of driving change, I think is an essential. Then I want to sort of look at the idea of investing in trust. And I think some of the best coalitions I come across aren't just there to drive action. Of course they are, but it's action also underpinned by a sense of trust that we are going to be open with each other where we don't think things are going well, where we would have tried things as an organization, of course, hopefully led by evidence, but hasn't worked. And we're feeding into the collective wisdom that people then internalize and use in their own work. Or that we work on co-pilots together, that there are assets that one organization brings to the table that another organization may not have. And that we can recognize where we can combine our strengths and sort of downplay our weaknesses by working together. That requires trust. And I think what's interesting is the coalitions which I think work effectively actually invest a lot of time in building relationships, even before launch, that there is a sort of process of socializing what we're trying to do, making sure that in each organization who takes part, there's an embedding of the coalition's purpose throughout the organization, not just at one touch point. That trust leads me to the next point, which is organization. You can't build social coalitions for social change, I think, without an investment in an organization, a backbone organization that has the explicit focus of managing the coalition. Of course, you can run a coalition without having people dedicated or staff dedicated to running with it, but it's just much more difficult. We were able to really spend every single day, every working hour, really honed on how do we continue to build momentum in the coalition? How do we hold ourselves to account? How do we make sure that some of the challenges, and quite frankly, we'll get challenges that we need to mediate, are mediated? And also, how do we act as an impartial party to all of this? Usually, not always, there's a party that brings people together, the sort of the convener, for want of a better word. It's really important that there's also an impartial group of people behind the scenes making things happen that people can trust, that don't have a dog in the fight, and are able to, as a result, get decisions made. And that leads to the final point I want to make on this, which is about governance, which is the boring but crucial part, I think, of making some coalitions work. And again, this may not be true for every single scenario, but I think sometimes having good governance can be critical. What does this look like? It looks like a structure that really enables people to really sort of understand what the breadth of the policy, for example, options are, and to then make a decision. What are our top 3 priorities? What are we going to put forward in our annual report? When we talk to government, what's our key messaging? When we sort of talk to the public, what are the 3 big things we want to leave the public with? There will be naturally a debate about those. There will naturally be disagreement. But I think having a form of decision-making can work really well. At the Fair Education Alliance, we had an annual summit where we had formal voting around a range of policies that people had come to an agreement that we should discuss and debate. And then we had a discussion. Because we had built that trust, it was held in the spirit of openness, of transparency, of frankness. And as a result, we were able to come with what I think was a set of really focused, really impactful asks. So that sort of covers some of the principles which I think are essential. I want to focus now on the importance of communications before I go to questions. And for me, one of the key benefits of having a coalition is your ability to really shape the national narrative, to really frame a social challenge in the way that you want it to be framed. Let's face it right now, the question about national narrative and really sort of taking an issue and discussing it, debating it, describing it, articulating it in a particular way is incredibly important, amplified by, of course, social media. But if you look at a host of issues, and we're in the midst of one, whether or not you believe we're in a culture war or not, there are some clear issues where I think one side is trying to portray it in one particular way for strategic advantage, and one side is trying to do the same. So one of the key things, and if you believe that framing issues is integral to whether or not those issues are advanced on or not, whether or not policy is passed, whether or not investment is made, whether or not minds are changed, I do, and I think there's lots of evidence to suggest it does, that having a group of organizations who use the same messaging, the same framing, the same language on a consistent basis in multiple arenas can be incredibly powerful, more powerful than various organizations with separate messaging, talking about an issue in separate ways, sometimes allowing people as a result to pick and choose which bit they fight. And so I think there's an actual sort of imperative on the communications front to really sort of have that consistency of messaging. And that's one of the main advantages, I think, of coalitions. But there's also another advantage, which is cutting through the noise. And it sounds hyper practical. And I think this probably resonates with so many people sort of at today's conference. And it certainly resonates with me, and it has done for quite a while, which is the proliferation, and I think many of it really good and really important. But there is, I think, a lot of pressure now on a number of issues. One of the things that we welcome as an organization is the increase of awareness of ESG issues amongst the business community. It's incredibly important, and it's a progressive force for good. But it does mean that sometimes there's a lot of noise. Sometimes there's a huge amount of information. I use the example of the sort of individual who wakes up in the morning and goes on LinkedIn or goes on Twitter or gets their email bulletins, which they may have subscribed to 20, and there's just a deluge of content. And it does raise a question, especially when a lot of people are fighting for attention, fighting for that space, saying that this cause is important, is how do you stand out and cut through the noise? And again, I think the power of organizations working together to streamline their communications is really important. The final point I'll mention on communication before I sort of answer some questions is that it's not just communications with the outside world, it's communications within that coalition for social change. This is sometimes a hard slog, and you'll get quick wins, but sometimes you're in it for the long haul. Most of the time, you're in it for the long haul, I think. So keeping a sense of momentum, optimism, a sense of positivity, and consolidating gains where they are made is incredibly important to keeping morale up. I think one of the hardest things about social movements and coalitions trying to address change is not falling into the trap of fatalism, and also keeping up momentum. And that's where communications can play a really key part. So if you're thinking about, I think, building a coalition to really drive social change, thinking about the cadence of activity and messaging, thinking about how you keep people together, thinking about at the moments where there is potential to fracture, there is potential to err or to step back a bit, or quite frankly, because coalition members are running their organizations and facing challenges quite rightly as the last year has demonstrated, may not have their heart in it. So keeping them interested, keep them motivated, keeping them passionate is incredibly important. So to round up, we are